Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. This is actually Judaism Mystified, as you mentioned off camera. I think that's a great moniker. So we were going to discuss your book, Becoming Elijah. Why is your book called Becoming Elijah, and what's the significance of his name?
Yeah, I entitled the book Becoming Elijah for two reasons. And one I'll explain, and the other I think we'll discover later as we discuss this amazing, unique figure. It means throughout most of the book, through I think 95% of the book, what becoming Elijah means is how did he undergo this transformation from who Eliyahu is like in the Bible? He's really a zealot, a fierce zealot for the one true God, and then who he becomes in Jewish tradition, which is really a kind of compassionate Jewish superhero, right? He shows up in the nick of time to save people. If somebody's falling from the roof, he'll swoop by almost like Superman and scoop him up. He can help people who are in poverty. He can inspire rabbis or mystics. So it seems so different than this fierce quality in the Bible. So I really try to trace how he goes through this transformation from a biblical zealot to a compassionate hero. In that sense, how does he become the Eliyahu HaNavi we all know and love and wait for each Pesach? As to his name, really, you find so many names in the Bible that have a divine element, right? Shemuel, many names that end with El, Daniel, or you have Yahu, right? Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu. Many biblical names have a divine element, but Elijah is unique because he has two. Eliyahu, my God is Yud He Vav He, right? Yud He Vav is just an abbreviation for Yud He Vav He. So my God is Yahu. It's almost that he's permeated by God. He's suffused with God. Maybe he's intoxicated with God. He's such an intense figure, and his name really reveals that.
It's I'm excited to see this journey of how we go from Eliyahu and TaNaKh to the Eliyahu we know today. I learned the story of Eliyahu HaNavi during COVID, actually, when we were in lockdowns, and I was going through Sefer Melachim at that time. We had time, you know,
Ah,
and it struck me as I was reading it for the first time. I'm like, whoa, like this is not how I'm used to picturing him, and this idea of how this metamorphosized throughout time always interests me. So this is going to be exciting.
yeah, for me too. I really worked on Eliyahu during COVID, especially. It was
Oh
kind
my
of
God,
going slow, and then I didn't have the excuses I usually have, and I actually got a lot done during that strange time.
fantastic.
So,
So
yeah, go ahead.
so I was going to say, so let's start with Eliyahu in TaNaKh. Let's start with his demeanor and his persona in TaNaKh.
Right. Yeah, let's run through a few of the stories and what his character is like. First of all, he seems to pop up out of nowhere, right? We don't hear anything about his birth, his growth, his childhood. I mean, that's true of many prophets, but with Elijah, it's even more so. Right in the middle of the book of Kings, we just hear all of a sudden that he's confronting the king of Israel, right? He's confronting Ahab. And what does he say to Ahab? We don't know why he says this, but he just declares there will be no rain. So the first thing we hear from Elijah is this prophecy of a drought. He says there'll be a drought. He doesn't say why, but it's pretty clear that this is because Ahab and Jezebel, right? The wicked Jezebel, things are usually blamed on the woman. Ahab and Jezebel have been worshiping Baal, have been promoting the worship of Baal and Asherah in Israel, and that's why God is now going to punish. Right? We have already in the Shema, right? If you don't follow the word of Hashem, if you don't follow God's word, then the rain will stop. And Elijah says there'll be no rain. So this doesn't go over very well with the king and the queen, obviously, and Elijah has to flee. He flees to a creek by the Jordan River, and he's fed miraculously by ravens. This is the first miracle. Elijah is really characterized by miracles. In fact, really, Elijah and his disciple Elisha are the great miracle workers throughout the whole Bible. No one else performs as many miracles as the two of them. So the ravens feed him miraculously. He can drink water from the creek. But after all, he's declared a drought, and pretty soon the creek dries up. He has to flee again, and God says, flee to area near modern day Lebanon. And there, God says, you'll find someone who will sustain you. He goes there, he finds a widow, and this widow doesn't seem very able to sustain Eliyahu. The widow is cooking the last meal. She says, I'm going to cook one more meal for my little boy and myself, and then we'll die. Elijah miraculously provides her with food. He says, your jug will never run out of oil, your jar will never run out of grain until the drought finishes. So the woman is overwhelmed, and she recognizes the holiness, the power of Eliyahu. But before too long, her little boy gets very sick. He's on the verge of death. Perhaps he dies. He at least goes into a coma, or he dies. And the widow lashes out at Elijah. Why did you come here? Why did you kill my son? So Eliyahu prays to God and miraculously brings the boy back to life, perhaps through resuscitation. That the boy is brought back to life.
Yeah,
and
it reads kind of like a ancient CPR, like he discovered CPR, unless he blows into him.
Yeah, you can explain how it happens, and still the widow is overwhelmingly, it's overwhelmed and eternally grateful. And then it turns out it's a few years have passed since the beginning of the drought, and God tells Eliyahu the time has come for the drought to end. So Elijah needs to meet again with King Ahab. He hasn't seen him since that first declaration of the drought. He runs into King Ahab's steward, Obadiah, and Elijah says, I need to meet with Ahab. And Obadiah says, well, I might, if I set up a meeting with Ahab, how do I know you'll show up? You never seem to, no one can locate you, right? Elijah really already, even before he later becomes who he becomes, he already in the Bible appears and disappears very quickly. In fact, Obadiah says something interesting. He says, when I leave you, Ruach Adonai Yisa'acha, the spirit of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh will carry you off to I know not where. So already there, it seems that Elijah can be carried by the wind, can be carried by the spirit. But Eliyahu says, I'm going to be here. I'm going to meet with Ahab. And he tells the king that he wants to have a contest, between Baal and the true God of Israel on Mount Carmel, or at that beautiful, impressive mountain, modern day Haifa. So Ahab gathers all of Israel, or at least many Israelites. They come to the mountain, and Elijah basically wants to have a contest between hundreds of prophets of Baal, 450 prophets of Baal, and Elijah alone. He's very often the loner, Elijah alone. And Elijah says, each of us, the prophets and I, each team is going to sacrifice a bull, and we'll see who can call down fire from heaven to burn up this sacrifice.
So at this
please.
point, just for context for everybody who's listening, the up until now, the Israelites they're kind of having like a dual loyalty, right? It's not that they're just following Baal, they're also following Hashem. They're kind of like playing it safe. They're
edging,
having an affair.
Yes, really, Elijah is forcing them finally to choose, right? Everyone likes a contest. So the people, they're somewhat attracted both to Baal and Asherah, the male and female Canaanite deities, on the one hand, and still they haven't rejected the God of Israel. They don't know who's going to answer their prayer. They want to, cover their bets. But Elijah is really black and white. Okay, later he becomes something different, as we'll see, but the biblical Elijah is very much a dualist. It's either you're with Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh or you're rejecting Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So in fact, he says to the people, Ad matai atem poschim al shnei hasi'ipim. How long are you going to jump back and forth between the two branches? Right, you're like a bird, not sure which branch it's going to land on. Elijah says, stop acting like that. Pick Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh or pick Baal. We're going to have a contest and see. So he lets the prophets of Baal go first. They start crying out to their God, calling out to Baal for hours. Nothing happens. Then Elijah says, why don't you try a little harder? Maybe your God is sleeping. Maybe he's off on a journey. Maybe he's trying to relieve himself. Seems that's what the Hebrew is really saying, although very few translations take it that way. But this, you could say, is the first moment of sarcasm in the Bible. Some people say that Elijah invented sarcasm.
Interesting.
Just cry out a little louder. Maybe you can wake up your God. So now the prophets of Baal go into a frenzy. They start gashing themselves. They dance. They cry out. Still nothing. They finally give up. Elijah steps forward with a very short prayer, 1 or 2 line prayer. He calls down fire from heaven. The fire comes, incinerates his sacrifice, and the people are won over. The people bow down, and what do they cry out? Hashem hu ha'Elohim. Hashem hu ha'Elohim. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is the true God. Okay, that may sound familiar because that, of course, has entered Jewish liturgy. And when is it chanted? At one of the most dramatic moments in the entire Jewish year, the very conclusion of Yom Kippur, right at the end of Ne'ilah. The cantor chants and the congregation responds, not 2 times, as it was chanted on Mount Carmel, but 7 times. But it's clearly taken from this passage in the book of Kings. So the great declaration of faith, right? Elijah has won the people back to God. You could say it's his greatest moment of triumph. But it doesn't last too long because meanwhile, Jezebel is back at the palace and it was her prophets who were defeated. And of course, after Elijah wins, soon after that, rain comes down. So fire has come down. The rain has come down to end the drought. But Elijah isn't very magnanimous toward the prophets of Baal. He doesn't try to win them over to monotheism. What does he do? He slaughters all 450 prophets of Baal. Maybe it means he had them slaughtered, but the Hebrew is vayishchatem, right? He was the shochet. He slaughtered them. Perhaps with his own hands, he kills all 450 prophets of Baal. Isabel is incensed. When Ahab gets back to the palace, she now wants to take her vengeance on Elijah. And she actually says, tomorrow, Elijah, you're going to be like one of them. You'll be like one of those prophets. Why doesn't she just outright kill him? She says she's going to kill him by the next day. That really gives Elijah a window of opportunity, a window of escape. And Elijah escapes southward out of the kingdom of Israel into the kingdom of Judea, where Ahab and Jezebel really can't catch him. But he goes further to Beersheba, into the desert of the Negev, and he's really broken. So soon after his great moment of triumph, he feels that what's going to happen now? Isabel will bring the people back to the worship of Baal. The Israelites are so ambivalent for the moment they've been won over, but he really feels he's a failure. You could say he has a kind of death wish. He actually asks God to take his life. He says, I'm no better than my fathers. I'm no better than my ancestors. Take my life. Fortunately, God doesn't give in, at least not right away. An angel revives Elijah, and Elijah finds himself wandering. He doesn't really know where, perhaps. He walks for 40 days. You can kind of get a hint. 40 days has some connection with a famous mountain. And he ends up at Mount Sinai. Right? The book of Kings calls it Chorev, but Chorev is Sinai in Jewish tradition. So he's at Mount Sinai. Moses, you remember, was on Mount Sinai for 40 days. With Elijah, it's taking him 40 days to get there. And he has an encounter with the Holy One, blessed be he. He has an encounter with God, a direct encounter with God. In some ways, there are parallels here between what happened to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai originally, hundreds of years earlier, and what happens with Elijah at Mount Sinai. You remember in the book of Exodus, there's fire and smoke. It seems like the mountain is burning. There's trembling, a kind of earthquake. And similar things happen with Elijah. You have a very powerful wind, then you have an earthquake, then you have fire. But the book of Kings goes out of its way to say, Lo baruach Adonai, God was not in the wind. Lo bara'ash Adonai, God was not in the earthquake. Lo ba'esh Adonai, God was not in the fire. So if God is not in these loud phenomena of nature, where is God? God is to be found, one of the most beautiful phrases, I think, in the whole Bible, after these loud natural phenomena. What happens? Elijah senses or he hears kol demamah daqqah. Right? This is often translated from the King James Bible and onward, a still small voice. But that's not actually what the Hebrew means. Kol can mean voice or sound. Here it's really, I would translate it, a sound of sheer stillness. Kol demamah daqqah. For those of you who know Hebrew grammar, it's really a smichut. It's really a construct. Kol demamah, the sound of demamah. It's not the kol that is daqqah, because kol is masculine. It's the demamah that's daqqah. It's the sound of thin silence, the sound of thin stillness. That's where God is to be found. You could say it's almost a precursor of meditation. You don't find God in these loud phenomena. You find God in a moment of silence, a sound of silence. It could be that Simon and Garfunkel got the name of their famous song from this phrase in the book of Kings. It's really a sound of silence. That's where God is found. But Elijah doesn't really get the message. Because actually what happens, God says before this sound of silence, God says, Malakhi Eliyahu, what are you doing here? Maybe that's a critique of Elijah. Why have you fled from the people? You should be with the people. You should still be trying to bring them back to God. Well, Elijah says, what am I doing here? Kano kineti. I've been zealously zealous. Right? He really identifies himself as a zealot. This is a self-identification. Elijah says, I am zealotry personified, and the people have rejected your covenant. Elijah says they're out to get me. He really feels persecuted. He has something of a persecution complex. Reasons for that. He is being persecuted, but he somehow can't let go of that. Then after that question from God and the answer, it's then that you have the wind, the earthquake, the fire, finally the sound of sheer stillness. And then God asks again, Malakhi Eliyahu, what are you doing here, Elijah? The same exact question. Now, how does Elijah respond? Has he finally learned? Has he discovered God's presence? Has he learned maybe for this critique? You don't have to be loud and you don't have to lash out at the people. You should try to be gentle. No, he just answers the question the same way. Kano kineti, I've been very zealous. They're out to get me. They've rejected your covenant. So it seems that Elijah doesn't really learn the lesson, you might say. And then it's almost that God gives in to Elijah's request. You could say, some people would say, he's the only prophet who's fired. God says, go in a...
Resignation.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
Resignation.
Yeah, he resigns, or God says, go find your successor. What he says, go find your successor. I want you to anoint Elisha. Elisha ben Shaphat is going to be your successor. Elijah's never met him. God says, go find him here. You'll find him in a certain place, and he's your successor. And Elijah realizes his time is now drawing close. He wanted God to kill him. God hasn't killed him, but his career is drawing to a close. He anoints Elisha. Other things happen afterward. He confronts King Ahab again over the famous vineyard of Navot, but we'll leave that for another time. And please.
Before you move on from this story, first of all, with the sound of sheer stillness, it reminds me of Tehillim, L'cha dumya tehillah, right?
Yes.
Silence is the praise. Do you understand it as that he didn't get the message, or is it more that he's rejecting the message?
Yeah, it's hard to know. There's so many ambiguous things in the Elijah story. We'll come to a very dramatic one very soon. You really can't tell. Some people say, in fact, we have the same question from God, right? Malakhi Eliyahu. And then Elijah's answer is exactly the same. Kano kineti, I've been zealously zealous. Some Bible scholars say, well, they're not really two passages. It was one passage and some scribe mistakenly copied it again. It only happened once, and then you have the wind, earthquake, fire, and the sound of silence. But from the way we read the passage now, it seems that Elijah hasn't learned anything. maybe he's rejecting this idea of gentleness. He says he condemns the people. He can't stop condemning the people. So in a sense, he's giving up. It is a kind of
Yeah.
resignation.
You know what also
He's unable to reframe his understanding of or he's unable to reframe his attitude towards the people. He just can't do it.
Yeah, and that really explains what we're going to get to soon, how he changes his transformation. In the Bible, he can't do it, but before you know it, by the time we get to rabbinic literature, he can
Gotcha.
do it. So I think it's really, I think it's exactly that. The rabbis are troubled by the fact that Elijah can't change course, and they make him change course.
You know, I think what's always striking to me when reading these, I mean, I read this story very early on in my life. My father used to tell me stories of TaNaKh since I was a little boy, and he, you know, I noticed that there's like a juxtaposition, obviously, between Moshe's experience at Har Sinai and his. Or obviously, the text is trying to bring those two stories together and make us
Right.
realize the contrast. In a way, the role is reversed, where God is playing the role of kind of what Moshe did, where he's like defending the people and don't give up on the people, and mecheni, not in a way like do not do this. But Eliyahu, he's almost challenging Eliyahu the same way God kind of plays that role the opposite way in the story of Moshe. I always find that to be very, very fascinating.
Yes.
That wouldn't be the only time. There's also textual comparisons between Noach and Yonah, and the roles are reversed again there too. There are textual similarities, which not for the extent, but by Noach, God is playing the I'm going to destroy the world, they're evil, but by Yonah, he's playing the benevolent, like forgive them, and these are you have compassion on the gourd, I'm not going to have compassion on everyone. So we see that there's this interplay is more than just here. It's sort of something that goes on in TaNaKh. It's interesting. Just wanted to add that. That's all.
Another observation is also how they exit. Their story ends. Moshe's is like a humble kind of private burial where we don't know where he's going, and the whole taken up in a chariot to the heavens. It's like purposefully. It seems like it's a purposefully like kind of exaggerate, trying to make a differentiation between the two characters.
Yeah, no, there are a lot of comparisons and then some important contrasts between Eliyahu and Moshe. The Midrash, I think it's Pesikta Rabbati, a relatively late Midrash. It lists, I think it's something like 30 or 40 parallels between Moshe and Eliyahu. There's many, many things, but the differences are really striking too. And Moshe learns to be compassionate a lot earlier than Eliyahu. But we're really coming now to the end of Eliyahu's biblical career, you could say. He anoints Elisha. He does one or two more things, does a couple more things. But then we find Elijah and Elisha walking by the Jordan. They kind of do a farewell tour, actually. Eliyahu goes to various places around the Jordan, visiting Bnei HaNaviim, kind of the prophets in training. And there seemed to be a school of prophets, and they recognize Eliyahu as a master. And Eliyahu wants to bid farewell. And then Eliyahu and Elisha are all alone right by the Jordan. And we have this spectacular description, one of the most dramatic moments in the whole Bible, perhaps. A chariot of fire and horses of fire appear. In fact, the movie Chariots of Fire took its name from this scene. A chariot of fire and horses of fire appear. They come between Elisha and Eliyahu, and Eliyahu is transported, carried up to heaven in a whirlwind. So it's in a chariot and in a whirlwind. Again, we have the wind. Not here it's a se'ara, but like the ruach, Eliyahu is carried off by the wind. And the question really is, here we have a beautiful moment of ambiguity. Did Eliyahu die? Does this mean he died a spectacular death, or does it mean he escaped death entirely? And I've asked, scholars about this, and one wonderful scholar in Jerusalem, Shlomo Naeh, he said it's intentionally ambiguous. The Bible doesn't want to let you know, but something interesting happens. How does Elisha react? Elisha says, Avi, Avi, Rechev Yisrael ufarashav. Right? My father, my master, my mentor, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen. Now, is he talking about the chariot? Maybe he's talking about Elijah himself. Elijah is the chariot. Elijah is the one who's fighting for Israel. But more significantly, what does Elisha do? He tears his clothes. Now, of course, in Judaism, you tear your clothes when you're in mourning, right? If you're mourning over someone, right? We have Jacob tearing his clothes, other biblical characters tear their clothes. And Elisha is tearing his clothes. Why? Because he thinks Elijah has died. We don't know if he's died or if he's up there in heaven. Elisha thinks he's died, but this is the opening for the traditional belief in Judaism and in Christianity and in Islam that Eliyahu never died. He's up there in heaven. He's still in heaven. And if we're moving to perhaps the last thing in the Bible that we'll speak about, the prophet Malakhi, right? The prophet Malakhi, the last of the minor prophets, right? The very end of the entire section of Nevi'im, right? Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the Torah, the writing, the Torah, the prophets, the writings, the very last lines of the prophets is this brief book of Malakhi, the final chapter of Malakhi. What do you hear there? Hinei anochi sholeach lachem et Eliyahu HaNavi. Here he's called Eliyahu rather than Eliyahu. I'm sending to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of Yom Hashem, before the coming of the day of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the day of the Lord. So that's about as close as the Bible ever comes to saying the day of the Messiah. The days of the Messiah, the Bible speaks about Yom Hashem, the day of the Lord, the day of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Elijah is going to appear again right before the culmination of history, right before the time of the Messiah, you could say. That's how the rabbis understand it. So this must mean that Elijah is still alive. He's in heaven. He's waiting there. It could mean that he'll be brought back to life, but that's not what the verse says. I'm sending to you Elijah the prophet. So Elijah is in heaven and he will reappear. That's already being said in the Bible itself. That allows the rabbis, in a moment we'll get to who Eliyahu becomes in the Talmud, the Midrash, that allows the rabbis to say, look, the Bible itself is telling us that Elijah didn't die. Even though Elisha was fooled to thinking he died, he was really up in heaven and available.
Amazing.
Well, why do you think that the Navi left it ambiguous to begin with? His death. What do you think was the significance of that ambiguity?
I'm not sure. I mean, one possibility is that it means he did die, but he died in a spectacular way. You know, you could say everyone goes to the other world, to the other dimension after death, but Elijah did it in this spectacular, dramatic way, and Elisha tears his clothes. Maybe the pshat is that he died, but it's left open. I don't know, maybe just because it's great literature, it's great writing, and it's more powerful when something is mysterious. There's something so intrinsically mysterious about Eliyahu, right? He's really one of a kind. He's a loner. It's interesting how later he becomes so much of part of the Jewish family, right? We'll end up talking about the Seder. Elijah's at the Seder. Elijah's at every circumcision. Elijah's there every Saturday evening when we conclude Shabbat. He's part of the Jewish family. He's in the Jewish home. In the Bible, he has no home. He has no family. He may never have married. We never hear that he had a child. He's the ultimate loner. In fact, he says, I'm alone. Ani nisharti levadi. I'm alone, he says again and again. So he's unique and alone. And in his life, he was unique. And in his death, he's mysterious and unique. We just don't know what happened to him. And that leaves open everything else about his post-biblical career.
It's almost like they want to tell you that there's unfinished business with him.
Yeah, that's a great phrase. Unfinished business is really what it's about. There's something incomplete. Yeah. There's something incomplete in the story, and there's something incomplete in Elijah's personality. He has work to do, right? He hasn't gotten the message. He has work to do, and that's where we can move now.
Yeah, so let's move to the next segment about Eliyahu HaNavi in the Talmud?
So who is he in the Talmud? He appears a good number of times in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the Midrash. So what's he like? He hasn't lost his power. He hasn't lost his intensity. He hasn't lost his zeal, but he's starting to transmute that zeal into compassion. I would say one thing that happens with Elijah is his zeal or even his rage really becomes transformed into compassion. He's basically there to help people. He'll help people in need. In the Midrash, you find stories about people who have lost everything, who don't have a child, and Elijah announces that a child will be born. Elijah helps somebody find a gold coin. In the Talmud, it's not so much that type of miracle story. It's more that he's in touch with the rabbis. You have to be pretty special to gain what's called Gilui Eliyahu, a revelation of Elijah. You don't have that phrase exactly in the Talmud. It's a later medieval phrase, but it really describes what happens in the Talmud. We have time and again certain rabbis, right? Certain special worthy rabbis who merit an encounter with Elijah. So what happens when they encounter Elijah? Elijah will teach them something. He doesn't necessarily perform a miracle immediately. He'll teach the rabbi something and help him understand a difficult passage. Sometimes he might report a teaching from the heavenly academy, from Yeshiva Shomala, right? There's an earthly Beit Midrash, but there's also Yeshiva Shomala. So who's the head rabbi in the Yeshiva Shomala? The Holy One, blessed be he. And who are the students? The students are the souls of the righteous. If you lived a worthy life, if you studied a lot of Torah, when you get to heaven, you get to study Torah in the greatest academy possible, in the Yeshiva Shomala. So Elijah he gains admission into the Yeshiva Shomala. In some ways, he's an angel. He's described clearly as an angel later, but even in the Talmud, he's already angelic. So he's an angel who has a permanent place, a seat reserved for him, the Yeshiva Shomala, and he can convey teachings, right? The other people, you're either on earth or you're in heaven. Elijah is the in-between, right? We spoke a moment ago about the ambiguity. Elijah is the, one scholar has called him the virtuoso of the in-between. That's really who he is. So he straddles heaven and earth. He'll be in the Yeshiva Shomala, then he'll meet a rabbi on earth and teach him something. Sometimes the rabbi will ask a specific question. Elijah will answer it. Sometimes in late Midrash, Elijah asks the rabbi a question, and the rabbi might come up with an answer. So he's in dialogue. And one of his main roles is that he'll be the one to announce the Mashiach. So the rabbis pick this up from Malakhi. I'm sending to you Elijah before the day of the Lord. For the rabbis, that means he's going to announce the Mashiach. You even have a discussion, when will Elijah arrive, right? We're yearning for the Messiah. And the Talmud actually says, we don't know exactly when he'll arrive, but we do know when he won't arrive. Elijah will not appear on which day of the week? Elijah won't appear on Friday. Why? Apparently because people are too busy getting ready for Shabbat. If you're preparing for Shabbat, you don't want to be interrupted by having to go out and greet Elijah. So the Talmud says, maybe half in jest, Elijah won't come on Friday because we understand the reason to be because people are too busy getting ready for Shabbat. Then the question is, well, maybe he can come on Shabbat. Wouldn't that be wonderful? If Elijah came on Shabbat, the Messiah would come right after. What's the problem? Can you fly on Shabbat? Right, you can't travel more than 2,000 cubits. It's more than 2,000 cubits from heaven to Jerusalem. So can Elijah fly on Shabbat? The Talmud actually discusses this. And the question is really a halachic question. If you're 10 handbreadths above earth, okay, I think that's about 2.5 feet. If you're 10 handbreadths, this is a tefach. If you're 10 tefachim above earth, maybe you can fly. It's not decided. So we don't know if Eliyahu can fly on Shabbat or not. And actually, we can jump ahead now to something we were going to discuss later, but it fits in beautifully now. According to one explanation, this is why we chant songs to Eliyahu at Havdalah, because he can't come on Friday. We don't know if he can come on Shabbat, so we have to play it safe. He won't travel on Shabbat. Okay, Eliyahu, Shabbat is now finished. No more excuses. You have to come. That's why we sing to Eliyahu on every Motzei Shabbat.
You know,
I
there's
personally, oh, sorry, Benji, go ahead.
no,
Benji,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say something that's interesting about his character development in the Talmud also is that he's kind of like sensitive to, you know, look at people from a different angle. Like that, he's very black and white in the Navi, but
Yes.
in the Agadah, there's a famous Agadah about like one of the rabbis asks him which one of these people in the marketplace are going to Olam Haba, and he points out these, you know, two jesters. These two,
Right.
because they make people laugh, and like God really, like that's a side to them that only like God sees. So he's like he's looking deeper into people and giving them like kind of like damakavskut, you know, versus
Yes.
the Eliyahu in the TaNaKh, who is not like that at all.
Yes, that's a beautiful example. He's changing. He's becoming more of a mensch. He's becoming more human and more sensitive. What you mentioned reminded me of something wonderful. You have a great statement in the Talmud. It comes 2 times in the Talmud. Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Right? If there's a dispute, well, maybe only one person is right. No, both these and those are the words of the living God. One of the 2 times that appears, it's spoken by Eliyahu. So in the Bible, he's so black and white, right? You're either for God or you're for Baal. There's nothing in between. In the Talmud, he learns to appreciate differences and to bridge differences. And one of his roles, one of his messianic roles, according to the rabbis, according to the Mishnah, is that he will resolve disputes. He'll find a way to bring 2 parties together. He'll bring peace between contending people.
It's
But
almost
another, yeah.
Sorry. Go on.
Another very important thing in the Talmud is that he is a shapeshifter.
Mm.
That's an amazing phrase. I used to think that it came from Marvel Comics, because there you have, characters who can take on different form, but it's a term. It's a term in academic study of folklore. That's how it first appeared. A shapeshifter, you find this in ancient folklore. You even have it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. You have it in Greek mythology. You have it in fairy tales and science fiction. You have it in Harry Potter, Star Trek, Star Wars. So a shapeshifter is someone who can take on a different identity, a person who can become someone else. And Elijah does that. Okay, in the Bible, he's always, who he is, an intense, he can be compassionate. He's often zealot, but he doesn't change his basic character, his basic identity. In the Talmud, he usually appears as an old man. Okay, by the time of the Talmud, he is pretty old. He was born in the 9th century BCE. But he's not only an old man, he could be a slave, he could be a horseman, a Persian, a Roman dignitary, an Arab. His most amazing shape that he takes on is in a story about Rabbi Meir, right? The great sage Rabbi Meir was colleague, disciple of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Meir one time had to rescue his sister-in-law. His sister-in-law was imprisoned in a Roman brothel. So Rabbi Meir rescues her from the brothel, but because of that, the Romans are out to get him, and they actually post his picture on the gates of Rome. They say, anyone who finds this person, you'll get a reward. So Roman soldiers are out looking for Rabbi Meir, and they actually spot him. And they're about to grab Rabbi Meir, but who shows up in the nick of time? Eliyahu HaNavi, in the form of a prostitute. The prostitute, Elijah the prostitute, embraces Rabbi Meir. The Romans say, that couldn't possibly be the holy Rabbi Meir. We know he'd never do that. And in that way, Elijah saves a great sage of the Talmud. So he's a shapeshifter. And also that story shows something else. He breaks the rules. He does the unexpected. He's really unpredictable. And he's something of a trickster too. That appears already in the Talmud and the Midrash, and more so in later stages. He's hard to figure out.
As you're telling me these incidents in the Talmud, my intuition is telling me that what the rabbis are trying to do here, and I'm not saying that with conviction, this is just what's coming to me as you're saying it. It's almost like they want to critique Eliyahu HaNavi, but Chazal is never going to critique Eliyahu HaNavi. So what they're actually doing is that they're portraying him in a way that the reader who knows him from TaNaKh will automatically see the difference of the persona over here. And what they're basically telling you is, this is what God wanted from him, to be what we're portraying him as.
Right.
But they're not going to say that outright because he was one of the greatest prophets. So what they're going to do is they're going to with anecdotes, present Eliyahu in the way which maybe God was aspiring him to be in the actual Tanakh.
That's very good. It's very good. The rabbis are really reimagining him, or refashioning him, and that really happens age by age. It's almost that each generation reimagines Elijah. So in a sense, who Elijah becomes shows you the values of that particular age. Right? In the Bible, it's the battle against idolatry, and Elijah champions that. By the time of the rabbis, Judaism has developed. Judaism has evolved, right? Ethics are so vital, right? The Havdalah kamocha, zeklal gadol b'Torah. The most important principle is love your neighbor. Elijah is one who enables that and furthers that. But I think, really the term you could use here is tikkun. Sounds like a strange term to apply to Eliyahu HaNavi, but he undergoes a tikkun. Really means a repair or a mending. Something about his harsh character has to be mended, and you can say the rabbis are bringing that about, not overtly, but by showing, as you say, showing anecdotally how he's changed. But I'd like to think also, I think that's definitely true, but I think you could say as well, taking a broad perspective, Elijah realizes that he has to change.
Yeah.
So over the ages, Elijah is changing himself. As he's being changed and he's changing himself. He's finally getting that message of kol demamah daqqah, of the value of gentleness. And perhaps one more brief story we should look at before we move on to Kabbalah and the medieval time. The famous story, I'm sure many of you know, what's called tanuro shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai. It's a famous story in the Talmud. Rabbis are arguing, they're discussing, as they always do, and they're discussing whether a certain kind of oven, an oven that's constructed in a certain way, we don't have to go into all the details, but basically they're trying to decide, is this particular oven, can it become impure? Is it subject to tum'ah? Is it subject to impurity? And you have a disagreement between Rabbi Eliezer on the one hand and all of the other Chachamim on the other. The other Chachamim say it can be rendered impure. Rabbi Eliezer says, no, this particular type of oven can never become impure. But they vote, and Rabbi Eliezer is way, way outnumbered. And he says, I'm not going to give in. He says, if I'm right, I want this carob tree to prove it. And the carob tree is uprooted, just as Eliezer predicted, but the rabbis don't accept it. They just say, we don't follow carob trees. We follow our own discussion. Eliezer doesn't give in. He says, okay, if I'm right, I want the water in that aqueduct there to begin flowing backwards. The water flows backward. The rabbis say, we don't go by water. We go by our discussion. Finally, Eliezer's getting desperate. He says, if I'm right, let the walls of this Beit Midrash collapse. The walls actually begin to come in, but Rabbi Yoshua is there, and out of respect for Rabbi Yoshua, the walls don't collapse. They just kind of stay inclined. Still, the rabbis aren't willing to give in to Rabbi Eliezer. Finally, a voice comes out of heaven, a bat kol, a heavenly echo. A heavenly voice comes out and says, Eliezer's right. Still, the rabbis won't give in. How can you not give in to a heavenly voice? Because Rabbi Yoshua says, quoting the Torah, lo v'shamayim hi. It's not in heaven. Torah is no longer in heaven. God gave us the Torah, and the way we decide is how we have to determine the halakha. So it's an amazing story telling us about the power of rabbinic teaching and rabbinic discussion. But that's not the end of the story. We find out that sometime later, another rabbi, Rabbi Natan, runs into Eliyahu. He has a Gilui Eliyahu. He has a revelation of Elijah. And he says, I'm wondering, how did God react to that? When the people rejected the heavenly voice, what did God say? And Eliyahu says, famous line you all know, Nitzchuni banai. Nitzchuni banai. My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. God was trying to intervene and change things and say, let's go with Eliezer, but the rabbis now have the ball in their hands. It's an amazing story about the power of halachic discussion. But what to me is remarkable is that we only know what God felt. We only know what God was thinking because of whom? Because of Eliyahu. So even though he just has a line or two in that story, it's a very significant moment. He can convey how God feels. He knows how God feels. He knows what's going on in the upper world, and he reveals it to the rabbis.
Amazing. Let's turn to the mystical books, Kabbalah, Hasidut. Let's understand the persona of Eliyahu HaNavi in these texts.
Yeah, so he's already changed a lot, right, from the Bible to the Talmud. He's really become kind of the Eliyahu HaNavi that we know. But there's another element that's hinted at already in rabbinic literature, right? Eliyahu is teaching the rabbis, but with Kabbalah, we really find that Eliyahu inspires the mystics. After all, we said that he's in touch with the Ruach, right? He's carried by the Ruach, and then he's taken up to heaven in the Se'arah, in the whirlwind. But really, there's some connection here between Eliyahu and Ruach HaKodesh. Okay, the Holy Spirit. Really, I would say that in the Kabbalah, Eliyahu conveys the Holy Spirit to serious spiritual seekers. How do we know this? Well, the early Kabbalists, and of course, speaking of Kabbalah, Kabbalah develops very gradually, but you could say Kabbalah really emerges as a full-blown movement in Judaism in the 12th and 13th centuries in southern France and Provence, and then spilling over the mountains into Spain. That's where Kabbalah emerges, the 12th and 13th century. The Zohar is composed in Spain in the 13th century. But the earliest Kabbalists, from the end of the 12th century, the beginning of the 13th century, they don't themselves claim to have encountered Elijah, but in many traditions about them, it's reported that they had Gilui Eliyahu. They had a revelation of Elijah. So what does that mean? I think one thing it means is that if a Kabbalist came up with a radical new idea, let's say a Kabbalist said, God isn't male, God is equally male and female, or God is infinity. The name for God is Ein Sof, infinity, or God needs us. It's not just that we need God, God needs us. Okay, all these ideas have roots. They have hints already in rabbinic literature, but the Kabbalists came out and developed them into full-blown concepts and ideas. And if they were challenged about their ideas, they could say, I didn't invent it. Elijah told me. So I don't want to say that that's simply an excuse. I think what's going on here is it's really the question, what goes on in the creative mind? How does an artist, how does a genius come up with a new idea? You can think of this in music or sculpture or painting. Great artists will often say, it wasn't me, it was the muse, right? It was the spirit. It was somehow a divine illumination. It came through me. I was the channel, but I wasn't the inventor. And I think that's very, very profound, and I think it applies to mysticism. The Kabbalists didn't invent these ideas. They somehow, I would say they looked so deep within that they discovered something beyond. And Elijah is the figure that they attribute the illumination to. In other words, he's a personification of Ruach HaKodesh. He's a personification of the Holy Spirit. It's very interesting. You have one Kabbalist, famous Kabbalist, Moshe Cordovero. he actually says, a person might feel that he's coming up with it himself, but that could be Eliyahu speaking to him. In other words, the question is, does this happen within a person, or does it happen by him encountering something beyond his normal self? It's very hard to pin that down. And the Maharal of Prague, Yehuda Lev of Prague, he says, it might seem to the person as if those words came from himself, but they were the words of Eliyahu. So what is Eliyahu becoming? He's becoming the channel for illumination, the channel for inspiration. And in a remarkable passage, Chaim Vital, right, one of the great students, perhaps the greatest student of Isaac Luria in Tzfat, Chaim Vital actually creates a menu, or I would say a system, a technique. How can you attain Gilui Eliyahu? He actually describes
like a science,
almost a science. Listen to his list. This is how he says. It's remarkable. He says, if you want to encounter Elijah, here's what you have to do. First of all, teshuvah. Okay, turning back to God. Doesn't sound especially mystical. In fact, most of this list is just normal rabbinic teaching, fulfilling the mitzvot. It's number 2. Sincere kavanah during prayer, really meaning what you're saying. Intense study of Torah. Okay, nothing up to there is at all remarkably, especially mystical. That's normal, ethical Jewish teaching. Now it gets a little more interesting. An ascetic lifestyle, okay, limiting food and drink and sensual pleasures, eliminating negative traits. That's pretty difficult. Seclusion, frequent immersion in a mikveh, immersion in a ritual bath, meditating. This is remarkable. I would call it, you could call this normal mysticism. That's a phrase that Max Kadushin invented, a scholar of the 20th century. He said, if you really want to understand rabbinic Judaism, he's not talking about Kabbalah. If you really want to understand the Talmud, it's normal mysticism. What does that mean? There are ways that you can encounter God through your daily activities, right? Through a bracha. Through saying a bracha, you become aware of God's presence in the world. So this is an intense version of that. But Vital is trying to say there's a way to encounter Elijah, but what's significant is that he sees Elijah as one who's conveying Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. I would say one other thing that Louis Ginsburg, great Talmudic scholar of the 20th century, he says something I think is an exaggeration, but this is what he says. What Moses was to the Torah, Elijah was to the Kabbalah. Of course, you can't have the Torah without Moshe. Torah Moshe, it's the Torah of Moses. To say that Elijah is that central to Kabbalah, I think is stretching a little bit, but the reason he says that is because of the things that I mentioned, because the Kabbalists attributed their teachings to Elijah, and because Vital says it's possible to have a revelation of Elijah. So to be a mystic is to be in touch with something beyond yourself, something beyond your normal state of consciousness. And Elijah is the go-between. Elijah is that virtuoso of the in-between who connects you with something beyond your normal awareness.
So it's, in a way, the Kabbalists are sort of, while the sages tried to bring Elijah back down, it seems like the Kabbalists, instead of rendering him incomplete and trying to fix what's left to fix, they kind of doubled down on the persona of who he was and kind of just relegate him way up there in the heavens.
It's really interesting you say that, because it's hard to be too black and white here. We've talked about his change or transformation. There's a person I respect very much, an Israeli scholar, Oded Yisraeli, the scholar of Kabbalah at Beersheba, but he says this is overblown. Elijah doesn't change that much between the Bible and the Talmud. I think he's wrong. I think we can see an important change, but what you're saying brings me back to that. You do find Elijah already compassionate in the Bible, right? He brings this little boy back to life. he's trying to bring the people back to God because he believes in the one true God. It's not that he's a vicious tyrant like
But he's
Ahab might be.
detached. But he's detached.
He's detached, right? He's
Yes.
not in touch with the people. He becomes more human in Chazal. But of course, you know, for the rabbis too, he has a unique nature. He's really an angel. He's really an angel already in the Talmud. In fact, the Talmud, near the beginning of the entire Talmud, right at the very beginning of Brachot, the rabbis say, you know, Michael, the angel, the archangel Michael, he can cross the whole world in one swoop. For Gabriel, it takes 2. For Elijah, it takes 4. Elijah can cross the whole world in 4 glides. So he's an angel, but he's half human and half angel. He's the most human of all the angels because he can get upset, right? He can get upset. And the rabbis talk about that. In fact, one rabbi who was visited by Elijah. Now we've talked about why Elijah will visit a rabbi, because the rabbi is a sincere seeker or a very great scholar. Sometimes Elijah will stop coming to a rabbi. A rabbi who he's come to very often, he'll stop coming to him. Why? Because the rabbi did the tiniest thing wrong, the tiniest ethical infraction. Elijah will stop coming. So for one rabbi, Elijah shows up, then he stops coming, then he comes back. The rabbi says, why did you come back? And the rabbi says, well, because you insulted me. You said that I get angry. And the rabbi said, look, you're getting angry right now. So Elijah can get angry and he can be upset about things. But basically, the rabbis are humanizing him. And I think you're right. The Kabbalah then almost divinizes him. I want to read you one very brief quote. I actually have it at the very beginning of my book. This is from that same Kabbalist, Moses Cordovero. Look what he says. His mystery, he's talking about Elijah, his mystery is really the mystery of divinity spreading. Divine energy clothes itself in him, extending to the world. Elijah never appears in the world without the mystery of divinity revealing itself through him. The mystery of God on earth is the mystery of Elijah. The closest that divinity can possibly come to humanity is the mystery of Elijah. It's really a remarkable passage. I found that at the very end of my work. The book actually was already finished, and I found that I couldn't believe that Cordovero said that. He said it's kind of lost in one of his multi-volume works on the Zohar. But, it's shocking to say this, but I think you may have thought this already, or people hearing this, it almost sounds like this is a Christian talking about, who? The famous Jewish boy in Galilee. To say that divinity has entered him, it sounds almost un-Jewish. And yet here Cordovero is saying that, but it comes back to what you were saying. The rabbis are bringing him down to earth somewhat. And the Kabbalah sees him as the embodiment of Ruach HaKodesh.
And in some
remarkable.
Kabbalistic literature, correct me if I'm wrong, he's kind of associated with the angel Sandalphon, which is like,
yes.
He's kind of like the spiritual brother of Metatron, who is Hanoch. So like he's elevated to that stature.
Yes, he's identified with Sandalphon. Occasionally he's even identified with Metatron, but more common is he's identified with Sandalphon. So he is an angel and a very prominent angel. And that's in Kabbalistic literature, not that you wouldn't find in the Talmud, but you find it in Kabbalah. Yeah.
So I think one of the, maybe it's intentional or not intentional, but I think the direction that the Kabbalah took Eliyahu HaNavi, he's kind of like, the rabbinic tradition is kind of feels like it's like static or uncreative because there's this Yeridat HaDorot, and you have this imaginative new kind of movement which is like revelatory, right? It's a new, it's kind of the opposite, where the further down you go in history, the more revelations become, part of like, you understand what I'm saying?
You're saying in Kabbalah?
Kabbalah. It's like the opposite. Yeah. It's almost like, okay, the rabbis of the past were greater in let's say tradition, but now there's this new idea where like their imagination can kind of reveal new things that
Yes,
it's
yes.
opposite. Yeah.
Very, very much so. And I would say, what makes it especially interesting is that Kabbalah is simultaneously new and ancient. I'll say what I mean by that. The Zohar, right, the masterpiece of Kabbalah, which is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? Orthodox Kabbalists, really all Hasidim, all Kabbalists would insist that the Zohar really goes back to the 2nd century, was composed by or in the circle of Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But I think the three of us and most modern Orthodox and non-Orthodox Jews most non-ultra Orthodox Jews would say that would admit the Zohar is a medieval work, and the Zohar calls its teachings milin chadatin atikin, new ancient words. So what does that mean? If something's either new or ancient, how can it be new and ancient? Well, the Zohar is simultaneously new and ancient. First of all, because it pretends to be ancient. It pretends to be the work of Rashbi, but really it's written in the 13th century, I think mostly by the Kabbalist Moshe de Leon, Moses de Leon. So it's, in that sense, it's new and ancient. It's composed right now in 13th century Spain, but it pretends to be 1100 years earlier. But it's also new and ancient in a different way. These radical ideas about God. Take, for example, Shekhinah. The God is a feminine presence. Now, the Kabbalah does not invent the word Shekhinah, right? It never appears in the Bible, but you have it hundreds of times in the Talmud and the Midrash. So the question is, who is Shekhinah for Chazal? She's not the wife of God. You would never find in the Talmud that the Shekhinah is married to the Holy One, blessed be He. But you do find descriptions of Shekhinah in which she seems to be somewhat motherly, somewhat the compassionate, protective figure, right? She's hovering over the people Israel. She's sharing exile with the people. The transcendent Kadosh Baruch Hu, He's up in heaven, but Shekhinah is somehow the part of God that's with the people. So the roots of the Kabbalistic notion of Shekhinah are there, but she's not overtly feminine. And in the Zohar, she's Mrs. God. She's married to the Holy One, blessed be He. So that's something that's new and ancient. In a sense, you could say it's even more ancient because we spoke about Baal, right? But who's Baal's partner in the ancient Near East? Baal, Asherah, right? And the people are not only worshiping Baal, the masculine Canaanite god, they're worshiping the goddess Asherah. And we know that this was very widespread. You mentioned Ben C. I'm sorry?
They had these notions. Okay.
They had these notions. They were attracted to Asherah. You mentioned before that people were torn between the worship of Baal and the worship of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Some of them wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Some of them wanted to worship Baal and Asherah and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Some of them went even further. Archaeologists have found inscriptions. I'm giving this offering, or I'm offering this prayer to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh and his Asherah. So some Jews thought that Asherah was the consort of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. Right? We know that there was actually a statue of the Asherah in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash, for a good number of decades, right? During the rule of King Menashe, I think it was, or one or another kings had actually a statue of Asherah in the temple, which meant that must mean there were Israelites who thought that Asherah was the goddess. The rabbis, the Bible, of course, eliminates this. The rabbis speak of God almost solely in masculine terms, but you could say Shekhinah is in some way, I'm saying to a limited extent, is in some way the return of the ancient goddess into Judaism. That's what's so shocking about Kabbalah. And that's why the Kabbalists were very careful about spreading their teachings, right? They were intentionally cryptic and secretive because they knew this was quite shocking. Sholem, the great scholar Gershom Sholem, has a wonderful phrase for this. He says this is the revenge of myth. The return of the goddess is the revenge of myth. That Canaanite myth, which had been battled, which had been defeated by the Bible already, by the rabbis, it somehow retained a subterranean life, and then it emerges in the heart of rabbinic Judaism in the Kabbalah. So in that way too, it's new and ancient.
So it's so interesting.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Benji.
No, I was going to say, in a way, like Maimonides lit the match that brought this all from under the surface unintentionally. But, this is now like kind of the revenge It's an anti-Maimonidean movement.
Yes, yes. Maimonides is so important to the birth of Kabbalah. You know, we can talk about this more at length another time, but it's so vital. The Kabbalah is in many ways a reaction against Maimonides, as if he had gone too far, as if he had rationalized things too much. God becomes so abstract and so removed. For some of the Kabbalistic theology, Maimonides is very important in a positive way, right? They basically their idea of God as Ein Sof, God is infinity. Maimonides never calls God Ein Sof, but that depiction, that description of God is very Maimonidean. It's really right. God is beyond anything you can imagine. God is beyond anything you can describe. There's even a more radical name than Ein Sof, and that's the name Ayin, spelled with an Aleph. Aleph Yud Nun. What does Ayin mean? It means nothing. I don't mean it doesn't mean anything. It means nothing. It means nothingness. That's the name the Kabbalah gives for the highest level of God. It's really indistinguishable from Ein Sof. Infinity and Ayin are really one and the same. Now, where does Ayin come from? It really comes from Maimonides' negative theology. They're just taking negative theology to the extreme. Maimonides says what? The more you deny about God, the more you negate about describing God, the closer you are to understanding God. The Kabbalah just takes that to the extreme. Let's actually call God Ayin. That's the most accurate thing to say. God is no. It's not that God is nothing. God is no thing.
Right. It's
So
it's almost like they're hedging in a way because they're kind of taking this aspect, this Ein Sof, and then they're adding the other side of it, which is more like radical, and it's kind of
right.
like they can kind of dance between the two. But I also wanted to mention something that came to my mind in Yirmiyahu. There were a group of Jews who were worshiping the Queen of the Heavens,
Yes.
and
Yes.
that in a way that even crept into our Siddur during the high holidays, the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, during the Parnasah part where people do the Dikarnosa. There's a pasuk that's brought in over there from Yirmiyahu that references that. It's very interesting how that
Mm-hmm.
be part of the
Yeah. I think they're weaving kavanot for Malkat HaShamayim.
Kata Shamayim.
So that the goddess is there. The goddess is there in the background, right? Asherah, right? You have that word Asherah a good number of times in the Torah, right? Don't plant an Asherah. So what is an Asherah? It's a tree. It's either a pole or a tree. It's probably a tree. It's a sacred tree. So it's nature worship and goddess worship. It's there, and the Bible is fighting it. And Maimonides, you could say, it's trying to put the nail in the coffin by saying God is totally abstract. The Kabbalists say, what do you mean? God is male and female. So you're right. It's almost like the Kabbalists want to have their cake and eat it too. They
Right.
say ultimately God is Ein Sof, God is nothingness. And really there's an amazing passage in the Zohar where the Zohar says the Sfirot are real only from our perspective.
Mhm.
Ultimately, everything is just Ein Sof. But because of the limits of the human mind, we have to picture God in this way. So they're kind of admitting that this is to a certain extent a human projection.
Right. It's like the what became known as Seder Hishtal Shalut in the Hasidic works. But
Yeah.
what's interesting is that you know we joke about this a lot, but it's kind of like a literal metaphor. So
Hmm.
when it suits them, when it suits the argument for it to be literal, then it's literal. But when it doesn't
Right.
suit the argument, then it's interesting how they kind of have this amazing kind of way of introducing these ideas. Very unique way of doing it for sure.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. There's very little in the Zohar about Ein Sof. Maybe a total of 2 pages about Ein Sof and Ayin, but thousands of pages on Shekhinah and her romance with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, with the Holy One, blessed be He. So even though ultimately they say it's from our perspective, that's what they're writing about.
So before we move on to, I want to plug your translation of the Zohar, but I do want to end going back to first before we move to the next segment is the stories of Eliyahu HaNavi on the high holidays, or he comes on Pesach, right? And he comes to every Brit Milah, and
Right.
you know he shows up on Motzei Shabbat. So from what I understand, or the way I see it, is that in a way that's kind of God's quote unquote punishment for his behavior in the Navi, where he's where he has to, like, you wanted all the Jews to die. You weren't willing to stand up for them. Now, these are the three main ways that Jews declare their loyalty to Hashem, and I'm going to make you go to each one of these. You're going to be there because you're going to bear witness to the continuity that you wanted to deny. So I think that's one thing that I wanted to point out before, but I forgot.
Yeah, I would say that applies especially to one of those three. I think where it's clearest is in Brit Milah. Okay, now, why does Eliyahu show up at a circumcision, right? There's actually a chair for Eliyahu, right, known as Kisei Eliyahu. There are many of these. There's a woman in Beersheba who's written extensive studies on comparing different chairs of Eliyahu. It's an amazing work of art. So why does Eliyahu show up at the covenant of circumcision? The earliest explanation of this is in a beautiful midrash known as Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, right? The chapters of Rabbi Eliezer. We mentioned Eliezer before, who was the one in that story of the oven of Achnai, very interesting idiosyncratic figure in the Talmud. So there you have in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, it retells what happened at Sinai, right? God says, Malachafo, what are you doing here? And Elijah says, Kano kineti, I've been so zealous. And according to the Midrash, God says, oh, you're always zealous. Why are you always zealous, Eliyahu? You can never stop being zealous. And Eliyahu says, well, ki azvu britcha. They've abandoned your covenant. Right? And the word Brit, of course, is the same as Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision. God says, you think they've abandoned the covenant? From now on, you have to show up at every Brit. You have to show up at every covenant to witness exactly what you said, to witness that the people of Israel have kept the covenant. So there it's the clearest example where it's punishment. Some scholars say, even there, it's not punishment. It's a reward. You care so much about the covenant, you can be at every covenant. But I think the simple explanation of that passage is that really it's a punishment for Elijah's zealotry. He's been too zealous. He's been too antagonistic to the people. He denies that they keep the covenant. Now he'll witness that they have the covenant. The Seder and Havdalah, I think, are a little different. The Seder, okay, now anybody who, you could say every Jew in the world has some relationship with Eliyahu. Because, you can find a Jew who doesn't even go to shul on Yom Kippur. They may show up at a Seder, if not this year, last year, or when they were a kid. What Jewish kid was not at a Seder at some point in his life? There might be a few, but a very, very tiny percentage. And what do you remember? You remember what's so remarkable. Remember opening the door for this figure, even if he doesn't seem to appear. You open the door for Eliyahu. You have a cup on the table for Eliyahu. So what's the origin of that? It's very interesting. The door, actually, opening the door originally has nothing to do with Eliyahu. You could say it has to do with what we say at the very beginning of the Seder, Kol dichfin yeteh v'yechul. Anyone who's hungry, let him come and eat. Some people would open the door at their Seder so that people who needed to come in could come in. Or another reason, before it's ever connected to Eliyahu, another reason for opening the door is that this is known as Leil Shimurim, right? The night of protection. Already in Exodus, this night is described as a Leil Shimurim. There probably means a vigil. You should keep vigil on this night. You're about to leave Egypt. You're staying up all night. The firstborn have just been killed. We're baking matzah, getting ready for the journey. This is a night to prepare for the journey. It's Leil Shimurim. The rabbis took that to mean if this is a night of protection, you're so well protected, you don't have to lock your door. So it was a custom in the Middle Ages, before Elijah ever appears at a Seder, there was a custom to have the door unlocked or have the door open. But then it turns into opening the door for Elijah. That's a relatively late point. The door is open even before the door is connected to Elijah. Now, what about the cup? Having a cup on the table for Elijah, this doesn't appear until the 15th century. It's not in the Talmud. It's not in the early codes. It's not in Maimonides. No mention about a cup for Elijah anywhere before the 15th century. Why? Why do you have a cup? Well, everybody has to have a cup. We're hoping that Elijah will come to announce the Mashiach. He's going to need a cup of wine too. If he shows up, we don't want to delay the Seder. The Seder takes long enough as it is. We don't want to delay the Seder to find a cup, make sure it's clean, make sure it's kosher to Pesach, to get wine. So we have a cup of wine already. But the Gaon of Vilna has a more interesting explanation. how many cups of wine are you supposed to drink at the Seder? There's actually a debate about this already in the Talmud. According to the manuscripts of the Talmud, it's not clear whether it's 4 cups or 5 cups. Right? We now drink 4 cups, but there's a reference to a 5th cup. But at a certain point, there was a debate about this. In the Talmud, there was a debate. The Gaon of Vilna says it's still not clear. It's still not clear whether it should be 4 cups or 5 cups. When Elijah comes, he'll resolve all doubts. Right? We mentioned this before, that Elijah will resolve disputes. He'll help us understand what the right halachic decision is. He won't make a decision, but he'll clarify things enough that we'll see what the right decision is. So he's going to resolve the doubt. So we pour a 5th cup, but we don't drink it. And it's called the cup of Eliyahu, not because necessarily he's going to drink it, but because he'll resolve whether we should drink it. But once it was poured, it was understood that this is poured for him. So that's really the origin of the door and the origin of the cup. And now both of them are connected directly with Eliyahu. It's a beautiful, yeah, please.
Oh, I was going to say, when we talk about Eliyahu and resolving all doubt, in TaNaKh, Eliyahu was extremely black and white in terms of how we went about things. Extremely. There was he didn't give a minuscule. And I don't know, when I hear the idea of Eliyahu removing doubt, I think that's kind of displaying his persona, one that he was always sure about everything, and he was at 1,000 miles per hour, and there was no in between for him. There was no everything. You got what I'm saying?
Yeah, but on the other hand, he's going to be able to reconcile things. He'll show when it's clear. So in that case, in that sense, he's like he was in the Bible, without any doubt. But he'll make peace between contending parties. And really, remember what Malakhi says already in Malakhi: "Veheshiv lev avot al banim, v'lev banim al avotam." Maybe that's the most messianic thing possible, to bring children's hearts back to their parents, bring parents' hearts back to their children. So he'll reconcile things. Even though he was black and white, he'll be the one to make peace. So he bridges those two extremes.
Touches both points, yeah.
One more thing about Pesach, that the real connection between Eliyahu and Pesach is not the door, it's not the cup, it's that what is Pesach? Pesach is the time of redemption, right? The redemption from slavery in Egypt. And according to the rabbis, the Mashiach will come on Pesach. So for the final redemption will be on Pesach, just as the original redemption from Mitzrayim was on Pesach. If the Messiah is going to come on Pesach, he's going to have to be announced by Eliyahu. So that, I think, is really the original connection between Eliyahu and Pesach. And the door and the cup is what we remember, what we know now.
So
and Havdalah we really spoke about, really, that Elijah won't come on Friday. Well, could he come on Shabbat? Well, we don't know if he can fly on Shabbat or not. Okay, he can't come on Friday, he can't come on Shabbat. As soon as Shabbat is done, no more excuses, Eliyahu. You have to come. But here, too, you could say it's really about Mashiach, because after all, Shabbat is me'en olam haba, a taste of the world to come. And the Mashiach is described as Yom Shekulo Shabbat, the time that's full-time Shabbat, 7 days a week, 724 Shabbat. So it makes sense that Elijah would be connected with that messianic aspect of Shabbat. But singing to Eliyahu, invoking his name at the close of Havdalah is so beautiful. When I was growing up, my father taught us a melody that was new then. I'm sure you know it, Al Sfat Yam Kineret. Right? Al Sfat Yam Kineret, Armon Rav Tiferet, Gan El Shamnatua, Bo Etzlo Yanua, Migar Sham Rak Naar, Kaof Bidmi Yaar, Lomet Sham Torahu, Mipi Eliyahu. What about a little boy studying Torah at Yam Kinneret, straight from the mouth of Eliyahu? So that was a song we sang. It was a poem written in the 1920s, but my dad fell in love with it and taught us. That was kind of connecting Eliyahu. He didn't want just Eliyahu HaNavi. Wanted some new melody, some new flavor. But I
Beautiful.
think many Jews connect Eliyahu primarily with the Seder, but for many of us with Havdalah too.
I couldn't help but notice that it could be purposeful or not, and I think it is, but I couldn't help but notice that the character of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that's used in the Zohar kind of has the same kind of motifs, where in the Talmud he is this strict person who only sees black and white, and he's sent into the cave, and he's like he's kind of sent to Gehenom, right? He sent that extra year back into the cave because he didn't learn his lesson and he didn't know how to interact with human beings, and he thought they should be learning Torah all the time. And
Right.
then later in the Zohar and the Kabbalah, he's like the face of God, and he is almost
Right.
like he becomes kind of like this kind of
Character.
deified character in a way, like
Right.
Eliyahu HaNavi. So I feel like there's like some type of
Yeah, very interesting. There's definitely a close connection. He's so harsh and extreme and, so chauvinistic in terms of Israel and the Goyim. And then in the Zohar, he's this beatific figure, and he's really divinized in a sense. So there's a connection between Rashbi and Eliyahu. And in the Zohar, Eliyahu appears and he's in touch with Rashbi, but especially in the later parts of the Zohar, what's called Tikkunei Zohar and Raya Mehemna. They're two later parts of the Zohar, written a little bit after the other parts. And there Eliyahu plays a very prominent role. And he and Rabbi Shimon are in close discussion. And in fact, Eliyahu praises Rabbi Shimon and says, so it's a really connection. It's interesting. You mentioned the cave story. Eliyahu makes a short appearance there right after Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar are in the cave for 12 years, and Eliyahu doesn't have direct contact with him. What happens is Eliyahu passes by at the end of 12 years and says, "Who's going to tell Rabbi Shimon that he can come out?" Because the Roman emperor had died, the emperor who wanted to kill him, or the Roman ruler who wanted to kill him had died, and Eliyahu makes it known, but Rabbi Shimon has no direct contact. Well, what happens in the Zohar? That story is retold, the story of Rabbi Shimon in the cave. But what happens? Eliyahu goes in every day and teaches them Torah. He doesn't appear at the end of 12 years. He appears every day and teaches Torah to Rabbi Shimon. So you could say, and that's really the origin story of the Zohar. In the Zohar, the Zohar says Rabbi Shimon, when he was in the cave, Eliyahu taught him Torah. What's the record of what Eliyahu taught him? The Zohar. So the Zohar was born from Gilui Eliyahu, from Eliyahu appearing to Rabbi Shimon. That seems to be the Zohar's own understanding of how the Zohar emerged. And that's how Kabbalists understood it, that the Zohar was composed in the cave, dictated or inspired by Eliyahu. So Eliyahu and Rabbi Shimon really, really closely connected.
So most of our listeners know how much we love the Zohar, but I wanted to actually get into your book because the translation of the Zohar, which is phenomenal what you've done, I want to understand why you felt it was necessary to translate the Zohar since so many translations exist. And you mentioned these controversial or revolutionary ideas that it introduced. What is it about? It's very obvious. I mean, everybody today is most Jews are very interested in Kabbalah and Hasidut. Why do you feel like it is relevant to today's reader?
Yeah, well, first, my translation. The reason I translated it was really because someone asked me to. A woman in the Pritzker family, Margot Pritzker, is married to Tom Pritzker, who is the CEO of the Hyatt Corporation. And she became fascinated with Jewish mysticism, and she started studying with an Orthodox rabbi, a man Yechiel Pupko. You may know or know of him, a very well-known Orthodox family, the Pupko family in Pittsburgh and Montreal and Seattle. So Margot Pritzker began studying Parshat HaShavua and Torah and Midrash with Rabbi Yechiel Pupko in Chicago. And after a while, she wanted to study Zohar. So they began studying the old English translation that existed then. This was back in the early 1990s, I think. And that's known as the Sonsino translation, was done in the 1930s. It's actually not bad, but it's more of a paraphrase sometimes. It skips over difficult passages. Sometimes there'll be a footnote. We've skipped the next 10 pages because they're impenetrable. And there's no commentary. But still, I found it interesting and useful. So they started studying Zohar using that. And after a while, either Margot Pritzker said to Rabbi Pupko, or he said to her, this is inadequate. Let's do a new one. So it actually came out of their Torah study. Their Torah study, being dissatisfied with what existed, they wanted to have a new one translated, and they contacted me through Arthur Green. And I was overwhelmed by it. I was fascinated, but I said, I have to take some time to think about this because I had some idea of what it would involve. So I said, let me think about it. I hadn't yet met or even talked with Rabbi Pupko or Margot Pritzker. Just Art Green said, of course, I understand. You need to think about it. So I thought about it for a week, for a few weeks, for a month, for a couple months. Then I decided, let me try it. So without contacting them, I had a month off from teaching in December, January break. For 1 month, I sat down and I just translated Zohar every day, 3 hours a day, a few hours a day, whatever I could manage. And after that month, I decided I'm definitely not doing this. It was too, I thought I would drown in the Zohar. So I called Art. I said, it's a wonderful opportunity, but I have to say no. And Art Green said, okay, I understand that you're going to say no, but why don't you just meet them and tell them no? So that was my mistake. I agreed to meet with them. I met with Margot Pritzker, and I'm sitting with Margot Pritzker and Rabbi Pupko and Art Green. And I basically tried to talk Margot out of it. I said Tishby already has translated a lot of it, and there's this Latino translation, and I just feel it's too much. She said, okay, I understand, but if you did do it, how long would it take? I said 12 to 15 years. She said, you're not scaring me. And somehow when she said that, something flipped inside of me. I said, oh, okay, I'll do it. So I was won over and turned into 18 years. It was an 18-year project from 1998 to 2016, 1997 to 2015. I actually did 9 volumes, which cover the Zohar and the Torah. There were 3 more volumes. We also did other later sections of the Zohar on Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, on Ruth, other passages. And that, the Pritzkers wanted it done by a certain date. So at a certain point, I agreed, and I tutored 2 other people who completed the entire project. So the whole thing is 12 volumes, and it ended up taking nearly 20 years.
Right.
But
the Zohar is not, people don't realize that, a lot of people don't realize that the Zohar is like an anthology more than it is a book, because it takes, it developed over time. So like, did you take on all of those parts of it, or just some of it?
We included everything that was completed, I would say, by the end of the 13th century. We excluded 2 components, 2 later components, Tikkunei HaZohar and Ra'aya Mehemna. I mentioned them briefly a little while ago. Those are imitations of the Zohar, written a little bit after the main sections. But even what we translated, as you say, it's almost a library. The main part of the Zohar is a running commentary on the Torah, and that is included. It's really a midrash. It's really a mystical midrash. In fact, one of its earliest names is Midrash HaNe'elam, the midrash, which could mean the concealed midrash, or the midrash of the concealed. It was also called Midrash Rashbi, the midrash of Rabbi Shimon. And gradually it's called the Zohar. But to go back to your original question, why I translated it. So I translated it because Margot wanted to be able to understand it. But I also translated it because what they found, that the earlier translations were inadequate. So they were inadequate because they didn't explain the symbolism. They didn't explain the sources. So a lot of what I do in my notes, half of each page is half is translation and half is commentary. My commentary, I show where the Zohar is drawing on the rabbis, where they're quoting from the Midrash, from the Talmud, and I explain the symbolism of the Sefirot, of Shekhinah, of the other qualities of God. And I also talk about the unique Aramaic, because we didn't mention so far, the Zohar is written in Aramaic. Why was it written in Aramaic? Why was it written in Hebrew? Hardly anything is written in Aramaic in the Middle Ages. Jewish books are written in Hebrew. The authors of the Zohar wrote it in Aramaic. Why? To make it look ancient.
Yeah.
Actually, Rashbi, could have written it in Hebrew or Aramaic, but they wrote it in Aramaic to make it look Talmudic.
Okay.
They wrote it in Aramaic to make it look like the Talmud. Their claim is really, this is the Talmud that disappeared. This is the part of the Talmud that never made it to us, and Moshe de Leon is making it available.
But the language, the Aramaic is obviously one of the indicators that it's not Rabbi Shimon is that it's like a very different dialect that he didn't speak.
It's a very unique Aramaic. It's really, there's no existing Aramaic dialect that matches the Zohar. In fact, in graduate school, I once asked a very fine scholar of Aramaic, I'll leave out his name because I don't want to, because of what I'm going to say, what he said. I wanted to do a readings course in the Zohar with this great scholar of Aramaic, because I wanted to see how he would analyze exactly what you're saying, the unique style of the Aramaic. And what did he say to me? He said, I don't deal in corrupt Aramaic.
Oy.
Wow.
So the Zohar isn't corrupt, but the Zohar is unique. It's idiosyncratic, because how did Moshe de Leon write it? He wrote it because he knew what? He knew the Talmud, and he knew Targum Onkelos. He knew the Aramaic translation of the Torah, because traditionally that's studied each week with the Torah portion, right? Shnayim Mikra ve'echad Targum. You read the Torah portion twice in the original, once in the Aramaic. Moshe de Leon grew up reading the Torah portion in Aramaic, so he knew Aramaic from studying the Talmud, from studying the Targum, and that's the Aramaic he used for the Zohar. But I would say he's really thinking in Hebrew and writing in Aramaic. And exactly like you said, that's how scholars finally caught him, because they realized this doesn't match the Bavli. It doesn't match Uncle's exactly. It's here and there. Sometimes a Spanish word will drop in. Sometimes it'll be Hebrew with an aleph added at the end, like devekuta. There's no Aramaic word devekuta. It's Hebrew devekut, cleaving to God. Moshe de Leon turns it into devekuta. He does that again and again, adding an aleph to a Hebrew word. So the Aramaic is strange, and because of that, many translations misunderstand it. What's unique about my translation, really one of the most important features of it, is that it's based on not a normal printed Zohar. Our normal printed Zohars have already been, they've been gone through such a process of corruption, you could say. What I did is I went back to the original manuscripts of the Zohar, and I changed the text based on better readings, what I considered better readings in the manuscript. So in a sense, I reconstituted an Aramaic text of the Zohar. That is not in print, although it will be at some point. Right now, it's on the website of Stanford University Press, the publisher. There you can find the Zohar, I think, closer to its original form than anything in print. I've underlined any time that I've made a change from the normal printed text. So my translation reflects that reconstituted text. You could call it a critical Aramaic text. It matches up with a normal printed Zohar most of the time, but when it doesn't, it's because I prefer to reading in a manuscript.
So I would imagine like translating something like the Zohar with all these, since you're a scholar of Kabbalah, I imagine that there's some influence from, let's say, later, because Kabbalah, these concepts developed. Like Sfirot did not mean what they meant in the Zohar in earlier time, and later, obviously they developed. So were you, let's say, very careful in not, superimposing like modern ideas into your solution?
That's very important, because there are many commentaries on the Zohar, traditional Kabbalistic commentaries on the Zohar, and I consulted as many of them as I could. I borrowed from them, I stole from them, you could say. Scholars say, what's the difference between what's plagiarism? Plagiarism is when you copy from a source, right? Well, what's research? When you copy from many sources. So, I mean, I borrowed, and I identified. I say, here I'm relying on this commentator or that commentator. The problem with Zohar commentaries is exactly what you said. They impose later understandings of Kabbalah on the Zohar, mainly Isaac Luria, right? Luria was the most famous Kabbalist. He was inspired by the Zohar. His entire Kabbalah is based on the Zohar, but it's his own unique understanding of the Zohar. And a modern Kabbalist will read the Zohar through the eyes of Luria.
Exactly.
I wanted to go back to Moshe de Leon or whoever else was involved in the authorship. So I try to explain what the Zohar meant in the 13th century.
Excellent.
And not what it meant in the 16th century. That's hard to do, but that was what I tried to do.
Excellent.
I should say also what distinguishes my commentary from other commentaries is partly that I'm going back to what I call Pshat HaZohar. I had one Zohar teacher in Jerusalem who spoke of that Pshat HaZohar. The Zohar is so much secretive, but it's beyond the Pshat. But to see what the Zohar means before later Kabbalists do their thing on it. So
I think Pshat is important. People think it just means simple meaning, but it actually means contextualizing, right? You have to understand it in its context as well.
Right.
So
sometimes it's not the literal, but often the contextual, right? So what I do in my commentary, I draw on traditional commentaries, but I also draw on modern scholarship, modern academic scholarship. Gershom Scholem, Isaiah Tishby, Moshe Idel, Yehuda Liebes, who's one of the finest Zohar scholars in the world. I draw on their works frequently. So it's the only commentary I think that it includes both the traditional Kabbalistic approach and a modern academic approach. I try to balance the two because I think you miss a lot about the Zohar. If you think it was composed back in the 2nd century, you don't realize that the Zohar reflects what is going on in Spain at the time. Christian domination, the king at the time, the tensions in the Jewish community, Maimonides. Maimonides is such a force to contend with. If you think it's composed in the 2nd century, Maimonides is irrelevant, but the Zohar draws on Maimonides, on Rashi. Sometimes the Zohar will take something right out of Rashi or Ramban or Ibn Ezra, sometimes agreeing with it, sometimes disagreeing with it.
And in what way would it, there's two, now that you brought it up, in what way, number one, do you see the influence of, let's say, the Christian surroundings of De Leon? And in what way do we see the contrast between the historical Rabbi Shimon, and let's say in his halachic opinions, and in the Zohar version of Rabbi Shimon?
Yeah, so the Christian influence is interesting. The Zohar is attacking Christianity, and yet it's also influenced by Christianity at the same time. The attack is for example, the Zohar says it's very important to have children. If you really want to be holy, you have to have children. And they're probably reacting against monasticism, against celibacy. There's one famous passage in the Zohar. It's probably the most famous passage in the whole Zohar. We know it because it's part of the liturgy, right? There are other passages that are part of the Sephardic liturgy, but there's only one Zohar passage that's part of the Ashkenazic liturgy, and that, of course, is Berich Shemeh, right? Be'ana Rachetz, that's chanted every Shabbat morning when the Torah is taken out of the Ark. That appears in the Zohar. It's actually not part, it actually doesn't appear in the earliest manuscripts of the Zohar. But there you have an amazing line, La'al enash rachitzna, v'la'al bar elahin samichna. We don't rely on any human. We don't trust, we don't believe in any bar elahin, ben Elohim. It could mean an angel, but literally it's what? A son of God. We don't believe in any son of God. It's really an anti-Christian polemic in the Zohar. We don't need a son of God. We're all children of God. We are all, Israel are children of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. So it's a polemic against Christianity. You have sometimes overt, sometimes more hidden attacks on Christianity. Even the demonic force, Sitra Achra, is identified with Christianity in some places. On the other hand, you have influence of Christian symbolism. By this, I want to be careful what I'm saying. I'm not saying anyone in the Zohar believed in Christianity, chas v'shalom, God forbid. But they're you could say maybe they're parodying Christianity. They're adopting certain elements. For example, triads. Okay, what's the most famous triad in Christianity? Obviously, the Trinity. Right. The Zohar plays with Trinitarian formulations. Right. For example, there were Christians who said to Jews, "Look, you have Trinity in your own prayer book. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem, Yud He Vav He, our Elohim, Yud He Vav He." There you have 3 divine names. The Zohar says, well, each of those names refers to one of the 10 Sefirot. So the Zohar is saying there is a triadic structure, but it's not what you think. They're attacking and imitating, sometimes simultaneously. As for Rabbi Shimon, he appears in the Talmud, right? He's a very important figure in the Mishnah and the Talmud, but halachically, his opinion is not followed, right? You don't just determine the halacha according to Rabbi Shimon. Sometimes the Zohar will go out of its way to accept an opinion of Rabbi Shimon, because he's, after all, the Botzina Kadisha. He's the holy lamp of the Zohar. He, as you said, he's given some divine qualities. One remarkable passage, he says, Rabbi Shimon says in the Zohar, my face is shining just like Moshe's face was shining. The difference is he didn't know his face was shining, and I know my face is shining. So he actually compares himself to Moshe and seems to say in some ways he's greater than Moshe. So the Zohar is remarkable and very, very beautiful, very inspiring, also very troubling. And of course, it was used and misused throughout the generations. Then there were later, attacks on the Zohar, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. Sholem really tried to, rescue the Zohar from the attacks of the Haskalah. And I know your whole project and your whole podcast is devoted to a more Maimonidean presentation of Judaism. Zohar is fascinating there because it's simultaneously influenced by the Rambam and fighting against the Rambam.
Well, we would love to have you on again one day to discuss the further development of Kabbalah, which would be very interesting.
Great.
And before we go, first of all, I want to say, give a shout out to our mutual friend, JJ Kimchi, because we did an episode on the Zohar with him, and you did it on his podcast
Yes.
recently. So that's kind of how we came together. And I just wanted to allow you to plug your course for the audience.
Great. Before I do that, there's one other thing I need to say about Eliyahu, and that's we talked about Kabbalah, but not Hasidism. And there's one element in Hasidism that's very important, and that will explain my title, Becoming Elijah. So in Hasidism, you have a beautiful notion, what's called Bechinat Eliyahu. Now, some of you might know the word Bechina as a test, but it really means more than that. It means an aspect. And Hasidism teaches, especially Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, the Chernobyl Rebbe, in his book Me'orei Nayim, The Light of the Eyes, he says every one of us has Bechinat Eliyahu. Each of us has an aspect of Elijah within. So what does that mean? You could say it means passion, or the desire to uplift, the desire to bring redemption, zeal, creative insight. There's something of that intensity of Elijah within each of us. You could say it's a spark of Elijah or a bechina, an aspect of Elijah. But the problem is it's hidden, and we have to identify that and fan that spark into a flame. And in that sense, each of us can, as it were, kiviyachol, become Elijah. And that's why I called the book Becoming Elijah. So on the one hand, it means how did Elijah turn from a zealot into the compassionate Jewish superhero? He really is the Jewish superhero. That's what becoming Elijah means on the one hand, but it also means, as I say at the very end of the book, where I talk about this Bechinat Eliyahu, that each of us can become Elijah.
So you're kind of taking me on another tangent, because the connection between Pinchas and Eliyahu is that something that pre Gilgul Kabbalah, is that something that is based on Bechina, or was that
that is fascinating, and let's spend just a minute or two on that. Pinchas hu Eliyahu, that's the phrase that comes. Pinchas hu Eliyahu. Pinchas is Elijah. Now that never appears in the Talmud or the Midrash, but apparently it was around already around the 1st century of the Common Era. People identified Pinchas with Elijah. Why? It's pretty clear, because they are the two great zealots, right? They're the two most zealous people in the whole TaNaKh. What does Pinchas do? He kills a fornicating couple, right? A couple who's involved with idol worship and fornication, and Pinchas stabs them both in the belly. And for that, God actually praises him. What does God say? I'm going to give you priesthood. I'm going to give to you and your descendants Brit. Again, Brit Kuhunat Olam. Why? Because he says, Pinchas bikano et kinati. Because Pinchas enacted my zeal. Really, the Hebrew is zealously enacting my zeal. Bikano et kinati. It's only 2 times in the whole Bible that you have that root kana, to be zealous. Only 2 times where it appears twice in one sentence. Once is with Pinchas, and the other time is with Eliyahu. We mentioned kano kineti. Right? Elijah describes himself as zealously zealous. So it's clear they're the 2 great zealots. So what does it mean to say Pinchas is Elijah? You could say it just means they share a personality trait. They are the 2 zealots. In that sense, Pinchas is Elijah. But it's more than that. I used to think, what you hinted at, that it's Gilgul. Maybe Elijah was a reincarnation of, maybe Eliyahu was a reincarnation of Pinchas. But that's not what it means. It means something much simpler. It really means Pinchas was Elijah. They're really one and the same person. Now, how could that be? Historically, it makes no sense. Pinchas was born probably toward the end of the 13th century BCE. Elijah lived 400 years later. There's no way Pinchas could be Elijah, but there's something strange in the Bible. In the book of Joshua, the end of the book of Joshua, we hear that Pinchas was still alive. And even in the book of Judges, this is a long time after Pinchas's career in the book of Numbers. Even in the book of Judges, Elijah is serving at the Mishkan in Shiloh. So he had a long life, even according to biblical chronology. If you stretch that a little, some people came to believe that Pinchas lived long enough to turn into Elijah. It's not that he died and was reborn, not that he was reincarnated, just he changed his name. Pinchas actually is Elijah. Now, this makes no sense historically. Ibn Ezra says Pinchas was not Elijah. Whereas Ibn Ezra is aware that people are saying that, he denies it. But I think even though it's historically ridiculous, it's psychologically very revealing, so that they shared this zealotry.
Right.
And you could say too that what it shows you is the timelessness of Eliyahu, right? If he's immortal, not only did he live longer than he lived in the Bible, he lived earlier than he lived in the Bible. He somehow he's elastic enough that he stretches from Pinchas to biblical later times.
He's from another era, like it reminds me of kind of like Og Melech HaBashan, that he's put in the time of Noah and Abraham and Moshe, really because he was hanging on to the boat of Noah. He's a remnant of that time. He is a character that would fit in that generation, and that mentality survived. But
yeah, so some of that applies to Eliyahu. We hear so many stories about what happened after his career. So Pinchas is what happened before. And in fact, we mentioned that midrash about the circumcision. Why does Eliyahu show up at a circumcision? Because God said to Eliyahu, "You're always zealous." And in fact, in that midrash, it says you were zealous when you were Pinchas, and you're zealous now that you're Eliyahu. It hints at saying you were zealous when you were Pinchas already.
The last thing we skipped this part, but I think it was very interesting, and only if you have a few minutes. But on who he is in Christianity and Islam. That's
that's quite a story, but I'll just try to give 1 or 2 highlights.
Sure.
So Eliyahu is central. You could say he's really central to Judaism in many ways. He's also really significant in the New Testament. Why is that? Well, let's go back to Malakhi, right? Or as Christians would say, Malakhi. Malakhi is the last of the minor prophets, right? So he's the very end of Nevi'im. We have Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah, prophets, writings. The very end of prophets is Malakhi. But if you ever open a Christian Bible, if you're ever stuck in a hotel room and you open a Gideon's Bible, there, of course, the Gideon's Bible has the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? The Old Testament is basically the Hebrew TaNaKh, but the books are in a little different order, right? None of the books are different. Some books are added, Apocrypha, But every book of the Hebrew TaNaKh is in the Christian Old Testament, but they're in a different order. The Torah, you have the 5 books of Moses, but then things start getting in different order. And where does Malakhi come? Malakhi comes at the very end of the entire Old Testament. In the TaNaKh, he's kind of in the middle of the Bible, the end of, 2/3 of the way through. In a Christian Bible, Malakhi ends the Old Testament, which means what? That the Christian Hebrew Bible ends with the prediction of Elijah coming before the day of the Lord. That's the last page of a Christian Old Testament. I'm sending to you Elijah the prophet before the day of the Lord. What happens when you turn the page? The Gospel of Matthew. So a Christian Bible connects Elijah with Matthew, Elijah with the New Testament. So does Elijah appear in the New Testament? He does. Who is he? Who would announce the Messiah? Now, the Christian Messiah, of course, is Jesus. Who announces Jesus? John the Baptist. And in the New Testament, Jesus says that John the Baptist is Elijah. Jesus identifies John the Baptist with Elijah. That's not that Elijah died. It's that Elijah is still alive, and now he's appearing as John the Baptist. So it fits for Christianity that Elijah will announce the Christian Messiah. But it's more interesting than that, because Jesus himself seems to identify with Elijah. Why is that? How could he be the Messiah and Elijah? That shows you something about the history of Christianity. This is something that's hard for a Christian to understand, but I think it's easier for a Jew to understand. Jesus did not originally think of himself as the Messiah, very likely. He thought of himself as a prophet. And he very likely thought of himself as Elijah. He may have thought that he was Elijah. He actually gives a sermon in his shul in Nazareth, right, in Nazaret, and he refers to Elijah and Elisha. Why does he refer to them? Because he says no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. So he refers to Elijah, who wasn't accepted by the Israelites, and he feels that he isn't being accepted by many of the Jews in Nazareth, right? Everyone there is Jewish. He's Jewish, and other Jews. He has a high opinion of himself. He's not sure the Jews accept that he's a prophet. So so Jesus may have identified with a. Then eventually Jesus comes to think of himself as the Messiah after his death. Messiah, that's later in his career, in his short career. So if he's the Messiah, he can't be Elijah. Who has to be Elijah? John the Baptist. So John the Baptist is Elijah. Jesus probably was first thinking of himself as Elijah, then as the Mashiach. So in that sense, he's very significant in the Testament. What happens at the end? The end, of course, Jesus is crucified and he's dying on the cross. What's the last thing that he says? He quotes a verse from Psalms. He quotes it in Aramaic. Eli, Eli, lama shavactani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It's amazing that that's the last words of Jesus. It's very authentic because nobody would make that up, right? A Christian wouldn't say that Jesus feels that he's abandoned. So it's very possible Jesus really did say that. He felt that he was doing holy work. He felt that he understood what Torah meant, right? He'd never thought of anything of inventing a new religion. He just wanted to be a Jew. You could say he was an early Jewish mystic. He felt he had an intimacy with God, and then he's killed. He's being executed. He says, God, why have you forsaken me? So he says, Eli, Eli, lama shavactani. Some people in the crowd thought what? That he was calling out to Eliyahu. The New Testament says that. Some people think that he was calling out to Eliyahu. Now, he wasn't. He was calling out to God, but that shows you how important Eliyahu was in the mentality of the time. It's fascinating.
Amazing stuff.
And the last point on Islam, and then
So that very briefly on Christianity. On Islam, there's an Elijah figure in Islam. Elijah actually is alive and well in Islam. He's not called Eliyahu, although sometimes he is. Ilyas. He's called Al-Khidr, which in Arabic means the green one. So this is this mysterious figure, very important in Islam, and he has many of the characteristics of Elijah. He's immortal. He can appear in various guises. He helps people in need, and he inspires the mystics. The great Sufis felt that they were visited by Al-Khidr. Now, why do I say Al-Khidr is Elijah? Not only does he share qualities with Elijah, when Muslims speak about Elijah, they refer to him as Al-Khidr. And more interesting than that, Jews living in Muslim lands, Jews who speak Arabic, sometimes refer to Eliyahu as Al-Khidr. So they are really one and the same. He's not mentioned in the Quran, but he's identified with a very important figure in the Quran, a messenger of Allah. And there's a story in the Quran that appears in a different version in medieval Midrash. So there's definitely a sharing there. So in Christianity and in Islam, both of them inheriting it, of course, from the TaNaKh, Eliyahu becomes very significant.
Thank you for spending all this time. You went over time, and we really thank you for that. Now,
Great.
before we go, just if you'd like to plug your course.
Yes, just very briefly, I teach a course online in Zohar, actually one in English where we look at my English translation, and another course where we study the original Aramaic. That doesn't require Aramaic fluency, but it does require Hebrew fluency. If you can read a midrashic text, or if you can read the TaNaKh and make some sense of it, or if you can read modern Hebrew, you're welcome to try the one where we do the original Aramaic. The English course is weekly, the Aramaic course is bi-weekly, and we basically study a few pages of the Zohar and discuss it. I teach for about an hour. In the Aramaic group, it's smaller. We have discussion as we go. In the English course, I teach for a straight hour, and then we have questions and answers. You can find out about it. I don't need to say much more about it. You can find out about it on my website, which is simply Daniel C. Matt, my middle initial C for Hanan, danielcmatt.com. If you Google Daniel Matt, you'll probably find it. Certainly Daniel Matt and Zohar. The Stanford site has, as I say, the Aramaic text. You can find that Zohar Stanford. But for the course, just on my website, you're welcome to join it. We study basically from after the Chagim through May, and then take a long summer break.
Very nice. I'm gonna put the link in the YouTube description, and I really want to thank you so much. This was so fun. This is a great conversation, and
Thank you.
Hope to have you on again.
Wonderful. It was great exploring him with you. All the best. Shalom.
Thank you. Well done. Thank you so much.
Bakasha.